Hey guys, tonight we're going to pull back the heavy, embroidered tapestry of medieval history and peer into a place often shrouded in secrecy and whisper, the king's bedchamber. Forget the grand tournaments, the valiant knights, and the pious crusades for a moment. We're going beyond the public persona of the monarch and into the world where power was not just wielded with a scepter, but also forged in the most intimate corners of a castle. Imagine yourself standing in a great, draughty stone hall, the air thick with the scent of beeswax and old timber. The throne sits grandly at one end, a symbol of authority. But what we're going to explore is how the very fate of a kingdom, the stability of a dynasty, and the lives of thousands could hinge on the actions that took place in a smaller, more private room, just a short walk away. This is a place where love, lust, politics, and power all tangled together with a royal knot, often leading to consequences that were anything but simple. You probably won't survive this without a few surprising revelations about what really went on behind those castle walls. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing at the nexus of the throne and bedchamber, where public and private life were not just intertwined, they were one and the same. To be a medieval king was to be the living embodiment of your kingdom. Your body was the body of the state, and your most private acts, especially those related to sex, were of paramount political importance. A mainstream historical fact confirms that a king's ability to produce a legitimate male heir was not merely a personal desire. It was a matter of national security. The concept of primogeniture, where the eldest son inherited the throne, was the bedrock of royal stability. If a king failed to produce a son, it could plunge the entire realm into a bloody civil war over succession, something no one, especially not a king, wanted on their conscience. You can see why a king's virility, or lack thereof, was not just a rumour, it was a matter for urgent state discussion. Imagine the pressure. Every time the king entered his bedchamber, it was not just a moment of intimacy with his wife, it was a strategic act for the future of his dynasty. Every morning the royal court would be on tenterhooks, hoping for a sign, a whisper, anything to suggest that the kingdom's future was a little more secure. It's like a corporate merger, where the only metric for success is if the CEOs have a baby, and if they don't, the whole company might get burned to the ground. That's a lot of pressure to put on one's bedroom. A quirky or fringe tidbit from these times relates to the royal bed itself. It was more than just a piece of furniture. It was a symbol of power and fertility. There are accounts of elaborate blessings and rituals performed on the royal bed to ensure a fruitful union. Sometimes, a king and queen would even have to perform their consummation in front of witnesses to prove the marriage was valid and that a male heir was at least a possibility. It wasn't exactly a private honeymoon. It was more like a job interview with an audience. And you think having your in-laws over is awkward. This relentless focus on heirs and royal duty led to a strange and often scandalous double standard. While queens were expected to be paragons of piety and virtue, producing heirs and little else, kings were granted a much looser leash. Their sexual indiscretions, mistresses, and illegitimate children were often tolerated, or even expected, as a necessary outlet for their virile nature. It was all part of the job, apparently. It's a bit like saying a CEO is allowed to have an affair as long as he hits his quarterly targets. Historians still argue whether the numerous accounts of royal promiscuity and bizarre practices in medieval chronicles should be taken as literal truth or as a form of moralistic gossip and propaganda designed to either praise a king's virility or condemn his moral failings. These chroniclers were often monks or rival courtiers, with their own agendas, and it's hard to know where fact ends and salacious fiction begins. It's a bit like trying to write a history book based solely on celebrity gossip magazines. You get the scandals, but you miss a lot of the truth. So, as the flickering light of the torches casts dancing shadows on the heavy drapery of the bedchamber, you begin to see that the most private space in the castle was anything but. It was a stage for political drama, a source of national anxiety, and a place where the fate of nations was quietly and sometimes bizarrely determined. The next time you see a picture of a medieval king, remember that his power was not just in his sword, but also in his bed. The flickering light of the bedchamber seems to grow more intense now, not with the warmth of love, but with the cold, hard pressure of statecraft. We've established that the king's body was a political instrument, but it's the queen's body that truly bore the weight of this responsibility. Your thoughts turn to her, a woman often plucked from a foreign court and placed in a new country with one singular, overriding task: to provide a legitimate male heir. The bedrock of medieval succession was the principle of primogeniture, a mainstream historical fact that dictated the throne would pass to the king's eldest son. This system, while seemingly simple, was a crucial defense against the chaos of civil war and a disputed succession. Without a clear male heir, competing claims to the throne could plunge the entire kingdom into turmoil, leading to decades of bloodshed and instability. For this reason, a queen's primary, and often only, purpose was not to be a loving partner or a wise counsel, but a vessel for the future of the dynasty. Her value was directly tied to her fertility, and more specifically, her ability to produce a boy. Imagine being that queen, a young woman, perhaps far from her home, under constant scrutiny. Your every meal, your every prayer, and your every moment in the bedchamber with the king was watched with an almost surgical level of political intensity. You were not just a person, you were the most valuable piece on the chessboard. Your success or failure would echo through the history books, determining whether your line continued or faded into obscurity. It's like a very high-stakes version of reality television where the prize is an entire country and the only challenge is getting pregnant with a boy, and you thought your family had high expectations. When a queen produced a son, she was celebrated, revered, and her place in the court was secure. But if she only produced daughters, or worse yet, failed to conceive at all, the pressure would become immense, a palpable tension in every corner of the castle. The king, the nobles, the common people, everyone was watching. This is a far cry from the modern gender reveal parties. These were centuries of national anxiety rolled into a single royal womb. A quirky detail from the royal courts relates to the lengths people would go to in order to ensure a male heir. Beyond just prayer, there were folk beliefs and strange practices. Some believed that certain positions during intercourse could influence the gender of the child. Others would commission special amulets or relics, often containing fragments of saints' bones, to be placed near the queen's bed in the hope of divine intervention for a boy. The most peculiar of these might involve the queen being given a concoction of dried herbs, powdered bone, and other oddities to drink, all on the advice of a court magician or a physician of questionable skill. It sounds less like science and more like a bizarre soup recipe, but when the fate of a kingdom is on the line, you try everything, right? The intense focus on male heirs and the subsequent devaluation of female succession is a well-known feature of this period. Scholars continue to debate whether this was a truly rational political strategy, pragmatic choice to avoid conflicta, a systemic reflection of a deeply entrenched patriarchal worldview that simply refused to accept a woman's right to rule in her own name. Was it a practical necessity or a cultural bias? The answer is likely a messy combination of both, a historical knot of power, gender, and tradition that was nearly impossible to unravel. This immense pressure on the queen to produce a son was the driving force behind many of the most bizarre and scandalous practices of medieval kings, from their need for mistresses to their desperate attempts to annul marriages. When the queen's body failed to deliver, the king would seek other, often less conventional, ways to secure his lineage. It was a search for a solution to the most pressing problem a king could face, a problem that could not be solved with a sword or a treaty. And that search would often lead them to some very dark and surprising places. As the immense, almost suffocating, pressure on the queen to produce a male heir becomes clear, you begin to understand why a king's gaze might wander. When the queen's womb seemed to fail, or when the political necessity of a marriage left no room for personal affection, the king often sought solace and companionship elsewhere. This, of course, brings us to the shadowy yet profoundly influential world of concubines and mistresses. This was a world of unwritten rules, a delicate dance of power and desire that was a constant undercurrent to the formal courtly life you read about in history books. The distinction between a queen and a mistress was stark, a mainstream historical fact that was fundamental to the medieval social order. A queen was a political asset, a dynastic partner whose primary purpose was to produce legitimate heirs. Her role was public, official, and sacred, blessed by the church. A mistress, by contrast, was a private matter, a companion whose role was personal, often sexual, and sometimes a source of deep affection for the king. Her children, no matter how beloved by the king, were considered illegitimate, a fact that would forever impact their lives. This created a peculiar and often tragic paradox. The king might adore his mistress and their children, but they would always stand outside the sacred, formal line of succession. The appeal of the mistress for the king was multifaceted. She offered a sanctuary from the intense political pressures of the throne, a place where he could be a man and not just a monarch. A marriage to a queen was a state alliance, not a love match, and affection often had to be sought elsewhere. A mistress could also provide a king with heirs when his queen was infertile, though these heirs could not inherit the throne. For a king, a mistress was a safety valve, a way to express personal desires without upsetting the delicate political balance of the royal marriage. It was a bit like having a work spouse, except in this case, the work spouse might bear children, live in the castle, and be at constant risk of a vengeful queen. For the queen, the presence of a mistress created a profoundly difficult and humiliating position. She was often forced to tolerate the other woman's presence in her court, sometimes even having to acknowledge and interact with her. A queen's power came from her official title and her children, not her husband's fidelity. She had to endure this arrangement with a quiet, regal dignity, understanding that a public display of jealousy could be seen as a sign of weakness and a political liability. You can almost feel the tension in the air, a constant, unspoken drama playing out behind every closed door. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this time is the French term maitresse en titre, a title that emerged in later centuries but had its roots in the medieval period. This wasn't just a mistress. This was the official mistress. She was publicly acknowledged, had her own apartments in the court, and her position was a formal part of the royal pecking order. This institutionalization of the mistress role highlights just how complex and accepted the system of royal infidelity could become. It's like a company creating a C-suite position for a side project, but in this case, the side project was the king's personal life. Historians continue to debate whether the institution of the mistress was ultimately a destabilizing force for the monarchy or a necessary safety valve. Did the king's focus on an unofficial family erode the authority of the legitimate one, or did it allow him to vent his personal desires without endangering the all-important dynastic marriage? The answer probably depended on the individuals involved, the strength of the queen, and the political acumen of the mistress herself, as we will see. So, as you hear the faint sound of a lute in the distance, perhaps a mournful tune being played for a queen or a celebratory one for a mistress, you begin to see that the medieval court was a hotbed of competing desires and loyalties, and the queen, for all her official power, was often just an observer in her own marriage. You've just considered the fundamental divide between the queen and the mistress, one a public symbol of power, the other a private comfort. But this distinction, you'll soon find, was not as clean-cut as it sounds, because while the mistress lacked a formal crown, she could, with a clever mind and a certain kind of cunning, wield a power that rivaled, and sometimes surpassed, that of the queen herself. This brings us to a fascinating and often overlooked aspect of the medieval court, the royal mistress's political power. The position of a king's mistress was a precarious one, yet it offered a unique and powerful channel of influence. A mainstream historical fact confirms that through her unparalleled access to the king's private life, a mistress could become a crucial confidant, a political advisor, and a powerful gatekeeper. While the queen's time with the king was often formal and ceremonial, the mistress's time was intimate and unguarded. The king might share his worries, his frustrations, and his political dilemmas with her in a way he never would with his queen or his male courtiers. Her bedchamber, in a sense, became a second throne room, where decisions were made and alliances were formed far from the public eye. Courtiers, ministers, and nobles were well aware of this back channel of power. They understood that to gain the king's ear they might first need to gain the mistress's favour. This led to a constant stream of supplicants seeking her out, showering her with gifts, and promising her land or wealth in exchange for a word whispered in the king's ear. She became a lobbyist, an unofficial broker of power, and an essential part of the political machine. It's a bit like trying to get a bill passed, but instead of talking to a senator, you have to convince his wife while she's having her morning tea. This was not a position without immense risk. A mistress's power was entirely dependent on the king's favour. If he grew tired of her, if he found a new favourite, or if she displeased him in any way, her influence and her wealth could vanish overnight. She had no formal title, no legal protection, and no real security beyond the king's affection. It was a high-stakes gamble for her, but a gamble that many were willing to take. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this time is the patronage of the arts by certain powerful mistresses. Not content with just political manoeuvring, some royal mistresses would use their influence to become patrons of poets, musicians, and artists, shaping the cultural landscape of the court. They would commission works of art, sponsor troubadours, and create a sophisticated, elegant counterculture to the more formal and rigid world of the Queen. It's like a Hollywood mogul's girlfriend deciding to produce her own avant-garde indie film, but in this case, the film was a medieval poem. Historians debate whether a mistress's influence was generally a stabilizing or a destabilizing force on the monarchy. Did she provide an honest, unvarnished perspective that allowed the king to make better decisions, or did she simply promote her own self-interest and that of her family, creating factions and rivalries that threatened the kingdom? The answer, of course, depended on the individual mistress. Some were wise and discreet, others were greedy and power, hungry, and their influence could be a double-edged sword. As you step away from the shadows of the mistress's quarters, you begin to see that the medieval court was a complicated web of official and unofficial power, and the woman who seemed to have the least power, the one without a crown, could often be the one with the most. This brings us to the most tangible legacy of a king's dalliances: the children born of these relationships, a group of people who occupied a very strange and complex place in medieval society. The royal mistress may have commanded influence, but her power was, as we've seen, a fragile thing, tied to a king's fickle affection. Her most tangible and enduring legacy, however, was in the children she bore for the king. As a king's dalliances filled the court with whispered rumours, so too did they fill the castle with the faces of his illegitimate children. These individuals occupied a strange and profoundly paradoxical place in medieval society, blessed with royal blood yet cursed with a permanent legal stain. The legal and social status of a king's illegitimate offspring was a complex knot, a mainstream historical fact that was both a blessing and a burden. On one hand, they were the children of the most powerful man in the land, a fact that could not be ignored. They were often acknowledged by their father, given titles, bestowed with vast lands, and married into important noble families to form strategic alliances. They might have been treated better than the legitimate children of lower nobles, a testament to the power of royal blood, even when it was tainted. On the other hand, they were forever excluded from the one prize that mattered most, the throne. The rules of primogeniture were immutable, and no matter how talented, beloved, or powerful a king's illegitimate son was, he could never be a legitimate successor. This created a life of extraordinary privilege coupled with an impossible limitation. You could be a duke, a military commander, or even a cardinal, but you could never be king. It's like being given a key to the best car in the world, but it doesn't work in the ignition. For the king, these children served a vital purpose. They were a loyal power base, a group of highly capable individuals whose entire fortunes were tied to his favour. He could place them in positions of power, trusting their loyalty far more than that of a potentially ambitious nobleman. They were his enforcers, his commanders, his eyes and ears in a world of treachery and intrigue. A curious piece of information from medieval England is the specific nickname given to many of these children: Fitzroy, literally meaning son of the king. It was a public and formal acknowledgement of their paternity, a title that both elevated them and, at the same time, permanently labelled them as illegitimate. It was a badge of honour and a mark of exclusion all at once. This formalising of their bastardy is a fascinating insight into a society that found a way to categorise and use a situation that would otherwise have been a source of pure chaos. It's a bit like giving someone a special name tag that says, "I'm important, but don't get any ideas about the corner office." Scholars of medieval history have long puzzled over the complex psychology of these children. Did they feel a profound sense of loyalty to the father who had given them so much? Or did a simmering resentment burn beneath the surface, a bitter knowledge of what they could never have? Did they plot for power? Or were they content with their privileged but sidelined position? The answer, of course, varied from person to person. Some remained loyal to the end, while others became rivals to their legitimate half-siblings, their royal blood, a constant source of friction and potential conflict. The lives of these children are a testament to the messy reality of medieval power. They were living contradictions, proof of a king's virility and a queen's political failure, all at once. They existed in a world of wealth and influence, but always in the shadow of a crown they could never wear. The fact that kings created these children, and then used them as tools of statecraft, is one of the more bizarre and cold-hearted aspects of the medieval monarchy, a system that valued dynasty above all else. The complex lives of a king's illegitimate children show us how medieval power could bend the rules of family and succession. But now, your thoughts turn to a much darker and more infamous aspect of a lord's, and by extension a king's power over his subjects, one that has been debated and sensationalized for centuries: the so-called droit du seigneur, or the lord's right. This phrase evokes a horrifying image of absolute feudal power, a sexual practice that, if true, would be one of the most bizarre and brutal in all of history. The infamous concept of droit du seigneur suggests that a feudal lord had the right to have sexual intercourse with a vassal's bride on her wedding night. It's an idea that has permeated literature, film, and folklore, becoming a potent symbol of aristocratic tyranny and the utter degradation of the peasantry. It sounds absolutely appalling, a brutal display of a lord's total ownership over the bodies and lives of his subjects. But here's the strange part. A pervasive historical truth is that there is almost no credible evidence that this was a widespread, codified legal practice in medieval Europe. You won't find a single law or charter from the period that explicitly grants a lord this right. Instead, most historians now believe that the droit du seigneur as a sexual act was largely a myth, a powerful piece of propaganda or folklore that emerged in later centuries, particularly during the French Revolution, to demonize the aristocracy and justify rebellion. It's a compelling story, a perfect symbol of feudal oppression, but in all likelihood, it never happened the way we think it did. So why then did the legend persist? It's because it was a perfect narrative. It perfectly captured the power imbalance between the lord and the peasant, and it made for a great yarn. It's the medieval equivalent of an urban legend that just won't die, no matter how many times it gets debunked. Yet, there is a fascinating, if less scandalous, reality behind the myth. A less common but well-documented practice that did exist was the lord's right to demand a payment, or a fine, from a newlywed couple. This payment was called collegium in some places, literally a right of the arse, and it was a fee to waive the lord's symbolic right to the bride. The couple would pay the fine to get permission to spend their wedding night together. So, instead of a lord showing up with a bottle of mead and a lecherous grin, he would send a tax collector. It's a bit less dramatic, isn't it? Sorry, but I'm going to need that tax payment before you get to your marital duties. It was a tax on marriage, not a sexual assault, and it tells us more about the economic exploitation of the peasantry than it does about bizarre sexual practices. Scholarly discourse continues on whether the legend of droit du seigneur had any basis in an earlier, more brutal and unwritten custom, or if it was entirely a post-medieval fabrication used for political purposes. Did the existence of a fee to waive the right suggest a more ancient, long-forgotten practice, or was the fee simply a clever way for lords to make money, dressing up a tax as a symbolic ritual? The answer is lost to time, but the myth remains a powerful symbol of a king's perceived power over his subjects. As you step away from this dark and contested corner of medieval history, you begin to see that even a king's power had its limits, or at least that those limits were often far more mundane and economic than we've been led to believe. The king may not have had a right to your bride, but he probably had a right to a hefty tax on your wedding. And with that, we turn to the more mystical and equally bizarre ways that kings tried to ensure the continuation of their line. The debate around the Lord's right shows us that not all medieval legends were true, but the anxiety that gave rise to them was very real, especially the anxiety surrounding a king's greatest duty, providing an heir. When a king's virility seemed to fail, or when a queen's womb remained stubbornly empty, they didn't just rely on prayer. They often turned to a bewildering array of fertility rituals and superstitions, a bizarre blend of Christian piety and pagan folk beliefs that existed just under the surface of official court life. The widespread use of these fertility rituals is a foundational truth of the period. A mainstream historical fact confirms that medieval kings and queens, desperate for a male heir, would engage in a variety of practices that often seemed to blur the line between religion and magic. These rituals were a way of taking control of a situation that felt utterly out of their hands. They were a form of spiritual insurance, a desperate attempt to persuade God, or fate, or some other unseen power to look favourably on their union. Some of these rituals were sanctioned by the church. A king and queen might go on a pilgrimage to a famous shrine dedicated to a saint known for his or her patronage of fertility, like Saint Anne, the mother of the Virgin Mary. They might pray to a specific relic, a bone fragment or a piece of cloth believed to have miraculous powers. But many other rituals were much less formal. They were whispers of folk wisdom, passed down from a court physician or a wise old woman. For instance, a king might be instructed to touch a specific ancient stone believed to have procreative power, or to drink from a certain holy well, all in the hope that it would make his union with his queen more fruitful. It's like a very old-school, very high-stakes version of hoping for a lucky charm. A curious folk belief that sometimes appears in accounts is the idea of sympathetic magic, where a king and queen would be instructed to eat certain foods that were believed to have a symbolic connection to fertility. The king might be told to eat the testicles of a bull, believing it would transfer the bull's virility to him, or a queen might be given the broth of a rabbit, believing its fecundity would rub off on her. The logic was simple, if a bit gross. You eat something with a quality you want, and you get that quality. It sounds more like a bizarre cooking show challenge than a medical treatment, but when the fate of a dynasty is at stake, you'll try anything. The academic community still grapples with the extent to which the church tolerated and even endorsed these folk rituals. Were they a form of sincere piety, a desperate attempt to use every tool at their disposal, or were they a cynical attempt to control the fertility narrative, allowing the church to take credit for a successful birth and blame a lack of piety for a failed one? The answer is murky, a testament to the way medieval people blended their deep-seated pagan beliefs with their newfound Christian faith. Ultimately, these bizarre fertility rituals show us just how high the stakes were for a king and queen. A king's power was only as secure as his ability to produce an heir, and if that heir wasn't forthcoming, no stone was left unturned, no magical potion left untasted, and no bizarre folk belief left unexplored. The royal bedchamber was, as we've seen, a battleground for the future of the kingdom, and the king and queen were willing to use every weapon at their disposal, no matter how strange. The bizarre fertility rituals show us just how desperate medieval kings were, but their desperation wasn't just a matter of prayer and superstition. They also had their own form of science, a kind of proto-medicine that attempted to explain the mysteries of sex and reproduction. You're now stepping into the royal antechamber where a learned physician, probably smelling of herbs and strange tinctures, is explaining the mysteries of the human body to the king. This is the world of medical theories on reproduction, where science and superstition were often one and the same. The dominant medical framework of the Middle Ages was the ancient Greek theory of the four humours, a foundational truth that held sway over Western medicine for centuries. A mainstream historical fact confirms that medieval doctors believed the body was composed of four primary fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. For conception to occur, these humours had to be in perfect balance in both the man and the woman. If the king's humours were too cold or too dry, or the queen's too wet or too hot, conception would not be possible, or worse, would result in a female child. It's a bit like a medieval version of a scientific manual, but with more bodily fluids and less actual science. This medical theory placed a bizarre emphasis on the sexual act itself. Unlike the ancient Greek belief that only the man produced seed, medieval doctors believed that both the man and the woman had to produce a form of seed or sperm for conception to occur. This was, in a way, a more egalitarian view, but it also placed an immense pressure on the woman. Physicians believed that a woman's orgasm was necessary for conception, as it was thought to draw the man's seed up into the womb. This meant that the king's satisfaction was important, but the queen's was, in a way, a matter of national security. It's like a very high-stakes version of a pre-game ritual, but with a lot more pressure and a lot less fun. A curious medical belief from some medieval physicians was that the best time for conception was immediately after a woman's period, when her womb was considered fresh and ready to receive the seed. They would also prescribe specific diets to both the king and the queen to get their humours in the proper balance for a male child. The king might be instructed to eat more hot and dry foods, like spices and red meat, while the queen might be given cold and wet foods, like fish and leafy greens. It's a bit like a medieval fertility diet, but with a lot more emphasis on making sure the king was feeling particularly virile. Academics of the period have long pondered the extent to which these medical theories were actually used to justify a king's infidelities. Was it a coincidence that a king's humoral balance often seemed to be best with a mistress, a woman who was chosen for her personal appeal rather than her political connections? It's hard to say, but it's not a stretch to imagine a king's physician telling him that his body was simply better suited to a younger, more vivacious companion. It's a convenient medical excuse for a wandering eye, isn't it? The medical theories of the Middle Ages, for all their strangeness, show us that a king's private life was never truly private. It was a matter of science, of humours, and of the body's mysterious inner workings. His fertility was not a secret. It was a matter for public discussion and medical intervention. The king's body was a machine of statecraft, and the doctors of the day were the mechanics, trying to get it to produce a male heir. And when that machine seemed to fail, they would often turn to a more reliable, if less official, source of companionship. As the court physician exits the bedchamber, having given his strange advice on humours and diet, the king is left to ponder his reproductive future. But his needs were not always about producing a male heir. A king's desires, like any man's, could be complicated, and sometimes they led him down a path that was far more scandalous and hidden than even the most public mistress. This brings us to a part of medieval court life that is rarely discussed, a kind of companionship that was both a secret and an open secret. Male concubinage at court. The existence of male concubines, or favourites, within medieval royal courts is a hidden, yet very real, part of history. A foundational truth is that while the church and society condemned homosexual acts, some kings, throughout the medieval period, did engage in these relationships. This was a form of sexual servitude, often associated with a very low social status and exploitation. These men, unlike female mistresses who could at least hope for a place in the court, lived a precarious and often dangerous existence. Their position was entirely dependent on the king's favour, and they were constantly at risk of being cast out, or worse, executed by a jealous rival or a moralistic nobleman. The double standard for these relationships was particularly brutal. A king's liaison with a female mistress, while frowned upon, was often tolerated as a natural, if regrettable, expression of his virility. His sexual relationship with a male concubine, however, was seen as a profound perversion, a sin against God and against nature itself. The social and political risks were immense. Not only was the king risking his soul, he was also risking his throne, as his enemies could use his sexual preference as a powerful tool to condemn his reign and even to justify his overthrow. These relationships were rarely between equals. The concubine's status was entirely dependent on the king's whim, and their lives were a constant negotiation of power and personal safety. The concubine was a pawn in the king's political game, a tool to be used and discarded. He was a piece on the board, but he was not a player. This was a far cry from the modern concept of a consensual relationship. It was a form of exploitation where the king's power was absolute and the concubine's power was non-existent. A curious piece of information from this period is the use of the term catamite, a derogatory term for a young male concubine, often used in legal and religious texts to condemn these practices. The term itself, which has its roots in ancient Rome, shows us that this was not a new phenomenon. It was a practice that had existed for centuries, and one that the church and society had been fighting against for just as long. The fact that they had a specific term for it tells us that it was a known, if deeply condemned, part of the social fabric. Historians of the period have long questioned how widespread these practices were, and if the historical records we have are accurate, or if they are just a form of political smear against a king's enemies. It's a bit like trying to write a history of a modern political scandal, but all your sources are from the opposition. You get the accusations, but you don't get the full story. Was a king truly homosexual, or was he simply a victim of a vicious smear campaign by a rival who wanted to condemn his reign? It's a question we will probably never have a definitive answer to. The hidden history of male concubinage at court is a testament to the hypocrisy of the medieval period, a time when a king's personal life was both a matter of public concern and a subject of intense secrecy. A king was expected to be a bastion of piety, yet he was often a victim of his own desires, and the church, for all its power, could not always control a king's private life. The whispers of male concubinage and the scandalous lives of mistresses bring us to a central conflict of the medieval world. On one side stood the king, a man of power and appetite, expected to produce heirs and fulfill his desires. On the other side stood the church, a powerful institution that held sway over the hearts, minds, and most importantly, the souls of every person in the kingdom, including the king. This was a place of monastic prohibitions and lust, where the strict religious ideals of the church clashed violently with the realities of royal sexual appetites. The medieval church's moral codes were incredibly strict, a foundational truth that permeated every aspect of life. A mainstream historical fact confirms that sex was seen as a necessary evil, tolerated only within the confines of marriage and for the sole purpose of procreation. Any sexual act outside of this narrow definition was a grave sin, a transgression against God that could jeopardize a king's immortal soul and lead him to eternal damnation. Concubinage, adultery, and other condemned sexual practices were not just social faux pas, they were mortal sins that the king was expected to repent for. This created a profound hypocrisy at the heart of the medieval monarchy. A king was expected to be a bastion of piety, a devout Christian who would lead his people to salvation. Yet, he was also a man of immense power, surrounded by temptation and a profound sense of entitlement. This led to a strange and often schizophrenic existence for many kings, who would spend their days attending Mass and praying to God, and their nights in the arms of a mistress or a concubine. It's like a corporate CEO who spends his weekends volunteering at a soup kitchen and his weekdays engaging in insider trading. The two sides of his life just didn't seem to fit together. This internal conflict often led to a peculiar form of spiritual negotiation. The king, knowing he was a sinner, would often try to atone for his sins with lavish donations to the church. He would commission the building of a new monastery, endow a cathedral with vast lands, or fund a new crusade, all in the hope that his good deeds would outweigh his bad ones. It was a kind of spiritual accounting, a way of making sure his balance sheet was in the black when he finally faced God, a curious penitential practice. Sometimes a part of this spiritual bargaining was for a king to take a vow of chastity for a specific period, perhaps during Lent or after a particularly sinful act. This was less about a long-term commitment and more about a short-term spiritual cleanse. The king would abstain from all sexual activity for a set number of days or weeks, a symbolic act of contrition to appease the heavens. It's a bit like a medieval version of a detox, but instead of cleansing your body, you're cleansing your soul. And then, once it was over, you'd go right back to your old ways. Historical scholars have long wrestled with the question of whether the Church's moral condemnation was a genuine spiritual concern or a tool for political control. Did the Church truly care about a king's soul, or did they just want to make sure he was in line with their agenda? By holding a king accountable for his sins, the Church could exert a powerful influence over his policies and his actions. A king who was a public sinner was a king who was vulnerable, and the Church was not above using that vulnerability for its own ends. The conflict between monastic ideals and a king's lust shows us that the medieval period was not as simple as we might think. It was a time of contradictions, of piety and sin, of power and submission. The king's sexual appetite was not just a private matter, it was a matter for the Church, for God, and for the future of his immortal soul. And sometimes, a king's desire for piety would win out, though it was a rare and often politically dangerous path to take. The conflict between monastic ideals and a king's lust often led to a lifetime of spiritual bargaining and quiet hypocrisy. But in a few, very rare and fascinating cases, a king would take the Church's ideals to heart, with a fervour that would send his entire court into a panic. This brings us to the astonishing and often politically disastrous phenomenon of the celibate king. For a monarch, choosing celibacy was not just a personal or religious decision. It was a profound political act that flew in the face of his most fundamental duty, to produce a male heir. The existence of celibate kings is a foundational truth of this period, a mainstream historical fact that stands as a stark anomaly in the history of medieval monarchy. In a world where a king's virility was the bedrock of his dynasty and the stability of his kingdom, a king who chose to abstain from sex was a walking, talking succession crisis. This wasn't a choice to be taken lightly. It was a choice that could invite foreign invaders, provoke a civil war, and ultimately lead to the downfall of his entire line. The motivations for such a choice were complex. Some kings may have been genuinely pious, their devotion to God so profound that they were willing to sacrifice their worldly duties for the sake of their immortal souls. Others may have had more political motivations, using their celibacy to deny a rival's claim to the throne or to consolidate power in other, less conventional ways. And still others may have been physically or psychologically unable to engage in sexual relations, their celibacy a matter of necessity rather than choice. It's a bit like a modern politician who decides to run on a platform of no parties, no fundraisers, no handshakes. The public would be both mystified and horrified. A curious historical figure in this regard is Edward the Confessor of England, who ruled in the 11th century. Edward took a vow of celibacy and never had children, a decision that led directly to a succession crisis after his death, paving the way for the Norman conquest of 1066. While many sources attribute his celibacy to his profound piety, there is also a suspicion among some historians that his choice was a political one, perhaps designed to deny the throne to his rivals. It's a fascinating mystery, a king whose most intimate decision had a cataclysmic impact on the entire history of his country. Historical academics have long debated whether these celibate monarchs were truly celibate, or if their celibacy was a post hoc religious spin to cover up a different kind of sexual deviancy, a political impotence, or even a different sexual preference. The Church, in its wisdom, would often canonize these kings as saints, turning their lack of heirs into a symbol of their piety, a convenient way of turning a political liability into a spiritual asset. It's a bit like a public relations campaign that's been running for 1,000 years. The choice of celibacy, for all its religious piety, was ultimately a profoundly political act. A king's body was not his own, it was the body of the state. And when a king refused to use that body for its most fundamental purpose, he was not just defying his own desires, he was defying the very nature of his kingship. This brings us to a central theme of our story. The king's body, whether celibate or not, was always, and in every way, a political instrument. It was a tool of statecraft, a symbol of power, and a source of both stability and chaos. The rare, politically dangerous choice of a celibate king highlights a fundamental truth about medieval monarchy. His body, whether used for procreation or not, was never truly his own. It was a tool of statecraft, a symbol of power, and a public canvas on which the kingdom's fate was written. You're now delving into the very heart of this belief. The king's body as state, where the personal health and virility of a monarch were seen as a direct reflection of the prosperity and well-being of his entire kingdom. This concept is a cornerstone of political thought during the medieval period. A mainstream historical fact confirms that the king's physical body and his political body, the body of the state, were viewed as inextricably linked. His health was the health of the realm. His strength was the strength of his armies. His virility was the fertility of the land itself. This was a powerful, almost mystical belief that legitimized his rule and connected him to the very earth he commanded. A king who was sick or impotent was not just a weak man, he was a sign of a sick or weak kingdom. This made his sexual acts and his ability to procreate a matter of divine importance, not just for succession but for the metaphorical health of his subjects. The king's procreative power was, in this sense, a kind of magical force. A fertile king meant a fertile kingdom, a land of bountiful harvests, healthy livestock, and a growing population. An infertile king, however, was a sign of a curse, a man who could not bring life to his kingdom, a sign of impending famine or plague. This created an immense pressure on the king to not just be a father, but to be a potent and virile father, a living testament to his divine right to rule. It's like a CEO whose personal life is an official company metric. You can imagine the public relations nightmares. A curious and rather gross analogy from the period's folklore and beliefs is the idea that a king's virility was tied to the health of his livestock. Some stories suggest that if a king was impotent, his cattle would fail to breed, his horses would go lame, and his fields would turn to dust. The king's sexual vitality was seen as a kind of magical force that permeated the land. It's a very weird kind of cause and effect, isn't it? Sorry, but the grain harvest is down again. The king must be having another bad week in the bedchamber. Historians of the period have long questioned the extent to which these beliefs were sincerely held by the common people, or if they were a form of state-sponsored propaganda to legitimize the king's power. Was it a genuine grassroots belief? Or was it a clever tool used by the church and the nobility to keep the king in line? The answer is likely a bit of both, a deeply ingrained folk belief that was skillfully co-opted and amplified by the ruling class. This belief in the king's body as state was a double-edged sword. It gave the king immense power, making him a living symbol of his kingdom, but it also placed him under constant scrutiny. His every ailment, his every sexual failing, was a public event, a sign of the kingdom's health, or lack thereof. This belief could be used to justify his overthrow, his removal from power, or even his assassination. If a king was seen as impotent, he was seen as a danger to the kingdom, a man who had failed in his most fundamental duty. The king's body was, in the end, never his own. It was a symbol, a tool, a public performance of power and virility. And as we will see, this belief in his divine and powerful body led to a strange and often terrifying sense of legal and moral impunity, where the king was often above the laws that governed his subjects, especially when it came to his sexual appetites. The belief that the king's body was a reflection of the state gave him immense, almost godlike power. His physical being was a symbol of his divine right to rule, and as such, he often saw himself as being above the laws that governed his subjects. This brings us to a darker and more troubling aspect of his reign, sex crimes and royal privilege, where a king's power could allow him to ignore or manipulate laws concerning sexual misconduct with terrifying impunity. The concept of royal privilege is a fundamental truth of the medieval period. A mainstream historical fact confirms that the king was often considered the source of all law, and as such, was not bound by it. He was the law, and he could bend it to his will. This belief created a legal and moral double standard that was both profound and brutal. While a commoner could be executed for adultery, a king could have numerous mistresses and concubines without fear of legal reprisal. His actions were, in a sense, beyond the reach of the law, a privilege that was both unwritten and universally understood. This legal impunity allowed kings to commit acts that, for anyone else, would have been considered heinous crimes. There are accounts of kings who would force themselves upon female courtiers, or even take peasant women from their homes, and there was often nothing a person could do. The king's will was law, and to defy him was to defy the state itself. The victims of these crimes had no recourse, no court to appeal to, no justice to be found. Their lives were simply an unfortunate footnote in a king's reign. A curious legal evasion that sometimes appears in the chronicles is the king's ability to simply declare his actions as not a crime. By using his royal decree, he could create a legal fiction that absolved him of any wrongdoing. He might say, for instance, that a woman he had forced himself upon was actually a concubine, and that the act was a matter of royal prerogative, not a crime. This manipulation of the law, a kind of legal sleight of hand, shows us that a king's power was not just physical, it was also intellectual, a power to shape and define reality itself. It's a bit like a modern politician who just says, "I didn't do it," and then makes it illegal to say otherwise. Historians of the period have long questioned the extent to which the church, or the nobility, could rein in a truly tyrannical king. Did they have any real power to stop him, or were they just powerless to a man who saw himself as a god on earth? While the church could excommunicate a king, or a powerful noble could rebel, these were extreme measures, and they were often more a matter of politics than a matter of justice. A king who was a sinner was a political problem, not a legal one, and a king who was too powerful was a problem for no one. This legal and moral impunity, this belief that a king's power was a divine right that superseded all human laws, is one of the most bizarre and terrifying aspects of the medieval monarchy. It gave kings a kind of absolute freedom, a license to do as they pleased, without fear of reprisal. But as we will see, even this absolute freedom had its limits, and a king's sexual life, even his most private and scandalous moments, was never truly his own. It was a matter of public concern, a matter for the court, and a matter for the church. The king's power was absolute, a legal shield against his darkest appetites. But even a king's private life was never truly his own. There was one night, in particular, when his most intimate act was not a matter of personal pleasure but a public spectacle, the royal wedding night. You're now entering the most bizarre and awkward of all medieval customs, the arranged marriage consummation. This was a ritual where the king's private life was put on display for the entire court, a moment of profound humiliation for the bride, and a moment of immense political importance for the kingdom. The practice of arranged marriage was a fundamental truth of the medieval monarchy. A mainstream historical fact confirms that royal weddings were not a matter of love, but of political alliances and dynastic strategy. A princess was a pawn on the chessboard of Europe, and her body was the most valuable piece she possessed. The consummation of her marriage, therefore, was not a private moment of intimacy. It was a public declaration of the new alliance, a physical seal on a political pact. To ensure this pact was sealed, the king and his bride were often subjected to a bedding ceremony, a ritual where a select group of high-ranking nobles, church officials, and family members would be present in the bedchamber to witness the couple's first night together. This wasn't a party, it was a formality, a ritual that had to be observed to ensure the marriage was valid in the eyes of both God and the state. The king and queen would be led to their bed, undressed, and placed under the covers, all while the witnesses looked on. The most brutal and humiliating part of this ceremony was the proof of consummation. After the witnesses left, the couple would be left to their own devices, but the next morning, the witnesses would return to inspect the sheets. They were looking for blood, a sign of the bride's virginity, and the marriage's physical consummation. If blood was found, the marriage was declared valid, and the witnesses would celebrate with food and drink. If no blood was found, it could lead to a scandal, a succession crisis, and even the annulment of the marriage. It's like a very high-stakes version of a wedding toast, but with a lot more pressure and a lot less fun. A curious exception to this bedding ceremony was often found in the case of a king who was marrying a pregnant bride. If a king, for instance, had a mistress who was pregnant with his child, he might marry her and simply have the wedding ceremony, skipping the bedding ceremony altogether. This was a way of avoiding the public spectacle of the consummation, and it shows us that even in a time of rigid tradition, a king could find a way to bend the rules to his will. Academics have long pondered the extent to which these public ceremonies were actually performed for all royal marriages, or if they were a tool used to pressure a reluctant couple into consummating the marriage. Were they a universal custom, or were they a rare and extreme measure, used only in cases of political necessity? The answer is murky, but the fact that they existed at all shows us that a king's private life, even his most intimate moments, was never truly his own. The arranged marriage consummation was a bizarre and brutal ritual, a moment of profound humiliation for the bride, and a moment of immense political importance for the kingdom. It was a time when the king's power was on display, but it was also a time when his private life was under the most intense scrutiny of all. It shows us that even a king who saw himself as above the law was still bound by the rigid traditions of his time. The public humiliation of a royal wedding night was a ritual of immense solemnity, a moment where a king's private life was scrutinized for the good of the state. But even in the midst of this intense pressure, there was one person in the court who could puncture the solemnity with a well-timed joke, a crude rhyme, or a piece of biting satire. This, of course, was the jester, or court fool, a figure who, for all his buffoonery, held a unique and vital role in the royal court, especially when it came to a king's sexual behaviour and taboos. The role of the jester was a foundational truth of the medieval court. A mainstream historical fact confirms that he was not just a clown, he was a social commentator, a satirist, and the only person in the court who had a license to speak truth to power. He could mock the king, his queen, his ministers, and his generals, and get away with it. This gave him a strange kind of freedom, a freedom to talk about the things that no one else dared to mention, especially when it came to a king's private life. The jester's license to speak was never more apparent than in his sexual humour. He was the one person who could openly discuss the king's libido, his inability to produce an heir, or his countless mistresses without fear of reprisal. He might sing a bawdy song about the king's virility, or tell a crude joke about the queen's barren womb, and the court, for all its solemnity, would be forced to laugh. This humour served as a social safety valve, a way for the court to vent its frustrations and anxieties at the king in a harmless way. It's like a very old-school version of a late-night talk show host, but with more bells and a lot more risk of being beheaded if you went too far. A curious detail about the jester's craft was his use of props. The jester's staff, or marotte, was often a small, hand-held stick with a carved head on top, often with a little fool's cap. This staff was a symbol of his office, but it was also often used in a way that had a sexual connotation. The jester might use it to hit people on the head, or he might use it in a way that was a bit more suggestive. It was a visual gag, a crude piece of humour that was both a symbol of his office and a symbol of his freedom to be lewd and irreverent. Academics have long pondered whether the jester's humour was a tool for social control, allowing the common people and the nobility to vent their frustrations at the king in a harmless way, or if it was a genuine form of social commentary that actually influenced royal behaviour. Was it a way for the court to let off steam, or was it a way for the jester to subtly nudge the king towards a better path? The answer is murky, a testament to the fact that the jester's role was often as ambiguous as his humour. The jester's sexual humour shows us that even in the most rigid of societies, there was a place for irreverence and satire. The king may have been a living symbol of the state, but he was also a man, with all the frailties and foibles that entailed. And the jester was there to remind him of that, to puncture his solemnity with a well-timed joke, to bring him back down to earth. This was the jester's most important role, and it was a role that he played with a crude and often brilliant wit. The jester's crude jokes about a king's sexual prowess must have stung. For a man whose virility was a matter of national security, such humour would have been a painful reminder of his greatest fear, impotence and the end of his dynasty. When faced with this fear, a king would often turn to a more tangible, and often bizarre, solution: aphrodisiacs and potions. This was a world of strange concoctions and remedies, a kind of medieval Viagra that was as much about magic and folklore as it was about medicine. The widespread belief in the power of aphrodisiacs is a foundational truth of the medieval period. A mainstream historical fact confirms that kings and their physicians would employ a variety of strange ingredients and concoctions to enhance a king's sexual performance and, more importantly, his fertility. These were not just for pleasure, they were seen as medical necessities, a way of ensuring the future of the dynasty. A king who was a potent lover was a king who was a potent leader, and a king who was a potent leader was a king who would have a long and prosperous reign. The ingredients for these potions were often bizarre and exotic. You might find powdered rhino horn, believing it would transfer the rhino's virility to the king, or crushed lizard tails, a symbol of the lizard's regenerative power. They might also use exotic spices, like cinnamon and ginger, which were believed to warm the body and increase blood flow, or they might use herbs, like ginseng and saffron, which were known for their stimulating properties. It was a kind of medieval cooking show, but with a lot more strange animal parts and a lot more at stake. The king's physicians, and sometimes alchemists and other court experts, were the ones who would create these concoctions. They were a strange mix of doctor, magician, and outright charlatan, and their advice was often a blend of medical theory, folklore, and wishful thinking. A physician might tell a king that his humours were out of balance, and that a potion of powdered pearl and a certain herb would restore his virility. The king, of course, would take the potion hoping for the best, and not knowing if it was the pearl or the placebo that was actually working. A curious recipe from some medieval texts is a kind of love potion or aphrodisiac made from a mixture of powdered pearl, dried bat's blood, and a specific herb, all to be consumed at a specific time of day or night. The recipe was believed to not only increase a king's virility, but also to make him irresistible to women. It's a bit like a medieval version of a dating app, but with a lot more strange animal parts and a lot more risk of getting poisoned. And you thought your dating life was complicated. Academics have long pondered the extent to which these potions actually worked. Was it a placebo effect, a genuine physiological response, or a complete fraud? While some of the herbs used did have some medicinal properties, it's safe to say that most of the ingredients were more symbolic than effective. The power of these potions was in the belief, the idea that a king was taking control of his own body and his own fate. The use of aphrodisiacs and potions shows us that a king's private life was never truly private. It was a matter of state, a matter for his physicians, and a matter for his conscience. A king who was a potent lover was a king who was a potent leader, and a king who was not was a king who was in danger. And a king, in his desperation, would often turn to a more reliable, if less sanctioned way of securing his dynasty, a way that was often far more bizarre and dangerous than any potion. A king's desperation for an heir could lead him down a path of strange potions and bizarre remedies. But sometimes, when all else failed, a king might turn to a practice that was not just bizarre, but a profound and disturbing violation of a universal taboo. You're now stepping into the dark, hidden history of royal incest and taboos, a practice that was as shocking to the medieval mind as it is to ours, but one that was, on rare occasions, sanctioned for a very specific and terrifying purpose: to preserve the sacredness of the royal bloodline. The practice of royal incest, though not widespread, is a grim truth of history. A mainstream historical fact confirms that in some royal families, particularly in the later medieval period, it was not unheard of for a king to marry a close relative, such as a niece or a cousin. The justifications for this practice were complex and rooted in a deep sense of self-importance. A king's bloodline was seen as sacred and divine, and marrying a commoner, or even a foreign noble, could taint that bloodline. Marrying within the family was a way of keeping the blood pure and ensuring that the throne remained in the hands of the right family. This was a practice of immense political importance. By marrying within his family, a king could prevent rivals from claiming the throne through marriage. It was a kind of political isolation, a way of ensuring that his dynasty remained a closed, impenetrable system. The consequences, of course, were often devastating. Inbreeding could lead to a variety of genetic disorders, from physical deformities to mental instability, and the practice was often seen as a sign of a decaying dynasty. It's like a family that's so obsessed with keeping a secret that they end up hurting themselves in the process. A curious example of this is the case of the Habsburgs, a royal family that ruled over a vast empire for centuries. While the most famous examples are from the later periods, their penchant for marrying first cousins and nieces began in the medieval era. The result was a dynasty that was plagued by a variety of genetic disorders, from a jutting lower jaw that became a family trait to a high rate of infant mortality. It's a sobering reminder that while a king might have seen himself as a god on earth, he was still bound by the laws of biology. Historical scholars have long wrestled with the question of whether royal incest was a matter of political necessity or a form of religious or moral perversion. Did kings genuinely believe they were preserving a sacred bloodline, or were they simply engaging in a taboo for their own political ends? The answer is murky, a testament to the fact that a king's motivations were often a strange mix of piety, political strategy, and personal desire. The practice of royal incest shows us that a king's desperation for an heir could lead him to some very dark and dangerous places. He was willing to risk the health of his family, the stability of his dynasty, and the condemnation of the church, all for the sake of a sacred bloodline that was, in all likelihood, nothing more than a myth. It's a powerful reminder that a king's power was not just political, it was also a kind of religious and moral delusion. This brings us to a new kind of royal desperation, one that was far more common and far more public than royal incest. A king who couldn't have an heir with his current wife would often turn to the church for a different kind of solution, a divorce. And as we will see, a king's desire for a new wife could bend the rules of the church in ways that were both brilliant and bizarre. The desperate quest for an heir led kings down a dark path of incest and bizarre rituals. But for many monarchs, there was a more common and slightly more palatable way to secure a new wife: divorce, or, more accurately, annulment. For in the medieval world, where the church held absolute sway, a king's desire for a new queen could not just be a matter of personal whim, it had to be a matter of holy law. And as you'll see, a king's power could bend that law in ways that were both brilliant and bizarre. The church's stance on marriage was unwavering, a mainstream historical fact that was fundamental to the medieval social order. Marriage was a sacrament, a holy union that could not be broken. Divorce, as we know it today, was almost universally prohibited, but there was a loophole, a legal escape hatch that a king could use to get out of an inconvenient marriage: annulment. An annulment was a declaration by the church that the marriage was never valid in the first place. To get one, a king had to prove that his marriage was void from the start, a legal fiction that allowed him to get a new wife without the spiritual guilt of divorce. The grounds for an annulment were often convoluted and bizarre. A king might argue that the marriage was never consummated, a claim that was often difficult to prove or disprove. He might also argue that he and his wife were too closely related, even if the church had granted a special dispensation for them to marry. The king would, in essence, ask the Pope to revoke his own dispensation, a move that was both bold and, for a king, often successful. It was a kind of legal blackmail, where the king's power was used to force the church to bend its own rules. It's like a modern CEO who asks his board of directors to change the company's rules just for him. A curious justification that a king might use for an annulment was the argument that he had an affliction or a curse that prevented him from consummating the marriage. This was often a subtle way of saying that his wife was barren, or that she was somehow magically preventing him from having an heir. The king could claim that he was a victim of witchcraft or of a divine curse, and the church, for all its solemnity, would often take these claims seriously. It's a bit like a medieval version of It's Not You, It's Me, but with a lot more talk of curses and a lot less talk of feelings. Academics have long pondered the extent to which the church was a truly independent moral authority in these matters, or if it was simply a tool of political power. Was the Pope truly concerned about the sanctity of a king's marriage, or was he just worried about the political and economic consequences of alienating a powerful monarch? The answer, of course, depended on the Pope and the king in question. Sometimes the Pope would stand firm, and sometimes he would bend to the king's will. The story of divorces and annulments is a story of a king's power and a church's weakness. It's a story of a king who, in his desperation for an heir, was willing to use every tool at his disposal, including the church's own rules, to get what he wanted. It shows us that a king's power was not just political or military, it was also a kind of legal and spiritual power, a power to shape the very rules of the world he lived in. This brings us to a new kind of royal education, one that was far more pragmatic than you might think. A young prince, knowing that his future would be dictated by his ability to produce an heir, would be prepared for the sexual demands of his role from a very young age. His education was not just in warfare and statecraft, it was also in the art of the bedchamber, and as we will see, that education was both thorough and bizarre. The king's ability to bend the church's rules for an annulment shows us just how high the stakes were when it came to producing an heir. And so, a young prince, a future king, was not just taught how to wield a sword or command an army, he was also given a unique and often bizarre education in the most intimate aspects of his future life. You're now entering the private study of a young prince, where a tutor is giving him a very pragmatic form of prince's sexual education, one that was as much about statecraft as it was about the physical act itself. The education of a prince was a foundational truth of the medieval period. A mainstream historical fact confirms that his training was designed to prepare him for every aspect of his future role, and that included his most important duty, to produce an heir. His education, therefore, was not just about Latin and military strategy. It was also a very direct and often clinical instruction on his own body, on a woman's body, and on the art of making a child. The goal was to ensure that when the time came for him to consummate his marriage, he would be not just willing, but also able to perform his duty with confidence and skill. The methods of this education were, by our standards, quite strange. A prince might be given a formal instruction from a trusted physician who would explain the humoral theory of reproduction and the best way to get his humours in balance for a male heir. He might also be given a more practical, hands-on experience, perhaps with a trusted courtesan or a servant who was sworn to secrecy. This was a form of royal training, a way of ensuring that the prince was not a virgin on his wedding night, and that he would not be embarrassed or humiliated by his lack of experience. It's like a very high-stakes version of a driver's education course, but instead of learning to drive a car, you're learning to drive a dynasty. A curious ritual that was often a part of this education was the use of specific tonics and diets designed to enhance the prince's virility. A physician might tell a young prince to eat a specific kind of meat, or to drink a specific kind of wine, believing it would make him more potent. The prince would be told that his body was a temple, a symbol of his kingdom's health, and that his sexual prowess was a sign of his future success as a king. It's a bit like a medieval version of a protein shake, but with a lot more talk of humours and a lot less talk of gym routines. Academics have long pondered the extent to which these methods were truly effective, or if they were more about preparing a prince for the political and social expectations of his role, rather than for the physical act itself. Was the purpose to make him a good lover, or was it to make him a confident and powerful king, a man who would not be easily embarrassed or humiliated? The answer is likely a bit of both, a blend of practical training and psychological conditioning. This pragmatic education shows us that a king's body was not just his own, it was a matter of state. His sexuality was not a private matter, it was a public concern. And a prince, from a very young age, was taught that his body was a tool, a weapon to be used for the good of the kingdom. It's a very different kind of education than we might think of today, and it shows us that a king's life, even in its most intimate aspects, was a performance of power and duty. This pragmatic, clinical approach to sex, however, stood in stark contrast to the romantic ideals of the time, the world of knights and ladies of love and chivalry. As we will see, a king's education in the art of the bedchamber was often at odds with the romantic ideals of courtly love, a concept that was both a source of inspiration and a source of conflict for a king. The young prince's education, you recall, was a clinical, pragmatic affair, all about humoral balance, fertility, and the duty of procreation. But outside the private study, the air of the court was filled with a different kind of lesson, one taught not by physicians but by poets and troubadours, the idealized and profoundly romantic world of courtly love. This was a world of chaste devotion, of knights pining for a married noblewoman, and of a love that was pure, non-procreative, and often unconsummated. And it stood in a profound and often bizarre conflict with the practical realities of a king's sex life. The concept of courtly love is a foundational truth of medieval literature. A mainstream historical fact confirms that it was a literary convention, a kind of romantic game that was played in the courts of Europe, where a knight would pledge his devotion to a noblewoman, often his lord's wife, and in return she would inspire him to great deeds of valour. This love was not meant to be consummated, it was meant to be a source of spiritual and romantic inspiration. It was a kind of romantic ideal that was both beautiful and utterly at odds with the king's reality. This created a profound conflict in the king's life. On one hand, he was expected to be a pragmatist, a man who would marry for political reasons and have sex for procreation. On the other hand, he was expected to be a troubadour, a man who would write poetry and sing songs about his idealized love for a married noblewoman. The king had to juggle these two competing ideals, often in the same court, and the result was a life of profound hypocrisy and bizarre social maneuvering. It's a bit like a modern politician who is expected to be a ruthless pragmatist, but is also expected to be a charming and romantic figure on social media. The two sides of his life just don't seem to fit. A curious symbol that was often a part of this romantic game was the ring. A knight might give his lady a ring, a symbol of his devotion, and she would wear it as a sign of her acceptance. But this was not a wedding ring. It was a symbol of a love that was outside of marriage, a love that was both spiritual and physical, but never quite consummated. It was a kind of romantic code, a way for people to have a romantic relationship without actually breaking the rules of the church. Historical scholars have long wrestled with the question of whether courtly love was a real practice or a literary fiction. Did kings actually live up to these ideals? Or was it just a game they played in their spare time, a way of escaping the brutal realities of their lives? The answer is murky, a testament to the fact that a king's life was a complex tapestry of political duty and romantic fantasy. The influence of courtly love on actual royal relationships was profound. It gave kings a new way to express their affection for their mistresses, a new way to romanticize their dalliances, and a new way to justify their infidelity. The mistress was no longer just a source of sexual pleasure. She was the king's lady, the source of his inspiration, a muse who would inspire him to great deeds. This romantic ideal, of course, stood in profound contrast to the clinical reality of his wife, a woman who was a political asset, not a romantic partner. The story of courtly love is a story of a king's hypocrisy, a man who was expected to be a pragmatist and a romantic, a man who was expected to be a warrior and a poet. It shows us that a king's life was not just about power and duty. It was also about love and lust, about romance and reality. This brings us to a much less romantic side of a king's life, a side that was often a direct result of his dalliances. As we will see, a king's sexual appetite often led him to a much darker and more painful place, the world of venereal diseases. The romantic world of courtly love, with its chivalrous knights and idealized ladies, painted a beautiful picture of medieval romance. But beneath that veneer of romance lay a much harsher and far less poetic reality. A king's many dalliances, his numerous mistresses, and his lack of medical knowledge often led him to a much darker place, the world of royal diseases of pleasure. This was a hidden history of venereal diseases, a silent plague that could ravage a king's body and, by extension, the health of his entire court. The existence of venereal diseases in the medieval period is a foundational truth of this era. A mainstream historical fact confirms that diseases like syphilis and gonorrhea were present in medieval Europe, though their origins and treatments were poorly understood. These diseases would spread through a king's many sexual partners, from his mistresses to his concubines, and could be passed on to his queen and, tragically, to his children. This created a profound sense of fear and anxiety in the court, a silent sickness that could not be discussed openly. The impact of these diseases on a king's body was often devastating. Syphilis, in particular, could lead to a variety of physical and mental ailments, from painful sores and disfigurement to madness and dementia. A king who was a victim of this disease was a king who was in physical and mental agony, a man who was slowly being eaten alive from the inside out. It's a sobering reminder that a king's body was not just a symbol of his kingdom, it was also a very fragile and mortal thing, a thing that could be broken by a single careless act. The impact of these diseases on the court was just as profound. The king's promiscuity could, in a very real sense, become a sickness that spread through his court, from his queen to his mistresses, and even to his children. A queen who was a victim of the king's dalliances could be blamed for her own infertility, her own stillbirths, and her own frail health, all while the king, in his divine right, was seen as blameless. It's a brutal kind of irony, a world where the victim is blamed for the crime. A curious remedy for these diseases was often found in the world of alchemy and magic. A physician, not knowing the true cause of the disease, might prescribe a strange and often dangerous concoction of mercury or other heavy metals, believing it would purge the body of the disease. The patient would often get sicker from the treatment than from the disease itself, a grim reminder of the limitations of medieval medicine. It's a bit like trying to fix a leaky faucet with a sledgehammer. It's a solution, but it's not a good one. Historical academics have long pondered the extent to which these diseases were a factor in the decline of some royal houses. Did a king's promiscuity lead to a weaker dynasty, a dynasty that was plagued by illness and madness? The answer is murky, but it's not a stretch to imagine a king who was a victim of syphilis, slowly going mad, making a series of bad decisions that led to the downfall of his kingdom. The hidden history of venereal diseases shows us that a king's sexual appetite was not just a source of pleasure, it was also a source of sickness, of pain, and of fear. It shows us that a king's body was not just a symbol of his kingdom, it was also a very fragile and mortal thing, a thing that could be broken by a single, careless act. This brings us to a new kind of royal spectacle, one that was just as intimate and just as public as a royal wedding. As we will see, a king's bedchamber, for all its privacy, was often a very public space. The king's body, ravaged by disease, was a testament to his mortality. But even as his health failed, he was still the king, and his most intimate space was still a public stage. You're now stepping into the bedchamber as a public stage, a room that, for all its privacy, was a central and very public part of the royal court. This was not just a place for sleeping, it was a place where power was displayed, where political alliances were forged, and where the king's health, and by extension his kingdom's health, was a matter of public concern. The idea of the king's bedchamber as a public space is a foundational truth of the medieval period. A mainstream historical fact confirms that the king's day was a series of public rituals, and his bedchamber was the stage for some of the most important ones. The king's morning awakening, known as the lever, was a ceremony attended by high-ranking nobles, ministers, and even foreign dignitaries. These men would watch as the king was dressed, his clothes a symbolic armour for the day's battles. The king's evening ritual, the coucher, was just as public. The same high-ranking officials would watch as the king was undressed and put to bed, his body a symbol of the kingdom's rest. These ceremonies were not just for show, they were a form of political intrigue. A noble who was allowed into the bedchamber was a noble who was in favour. A noble who was excluded was a noble who was out of favour. The king's bedchamber was a place where power was negotiated, where alliances were forged, and where a man's proximity to the king was a measure of his political influence. It's like a very high-stakes version of a company's Christmas party, but instead of being judged on your dance moves, you're judged on whether you were invited to watch the CEO get into his pyjamas. A curious piece of information about the bedchamber is the role of the valet, a personal attendant who had a unique position of intimacy and access to the king. The valet, for all his low rank, was a powerful man. He was privy to the king's most private moments, his most private thoughts, and his most private fears. He was a trusted confidant, a man who could speak truth to power without fear of reprisal. He was a kind of a secret advisor, a man who had more influence over the king than a duke or a cardinal. Academics have long pondered the extent to which these rituals were a genuine expression of a king's power, or if they were a form of psychological control over the monarch, making him constantly aware of his public role. Was the king a willing participant in this public spectacle, or was he a prisoner in his own bedchamber, a man who was never truly alone? The answer is likely a bit of both, a king who was both a symbol of power and a victim of his own symbolism. The bedchamber, for all its privacy, was a public stage. The king's body, for all its mortality, was a symbol of his kingdom, and a king's life, for all its intimacy, was a performance of power and duty. This brings us to a new kind of royal record, one that was far more candid and far more scandalous than any official chronicle. As we will see, the private moments in the king's bedchamber were often the source of courtly gossip, a kind of unwritten history that was passed from one noble to another. The king's bedchamber, a stage for political rituals and public scrutiny, was also a breeding ground for something far less formal and far more dangerous: gossip. The whispers of the court, the rumours of the king's health, his virility, his mistresses and his favourites were a constant undercurrent to the official business of the court. And these whispers, these scandalous tales, were often recorded by the most unlikely of sources, the medieval chroniclers themselves. The power of courtly gossip is a foundational truth of the medieval court. A mainstream historical fact confirms that it was a vital and powerful form of communication, a way of shaping public opinion, damaging the reputation of a rival, and even influencing the king himself. A rumour of a king's impotence, for instance, could embolden his enemies. A rumour of a queen's adultery could lead to her downfall. The whispers of the court were a weapon, a tool to be used and wielded with skill and a certain kind of malice. The medieval chroniclers, who were often monks or other court officials, were, in a sense, the original tabloids. While they were tasked with writing the official history of the king's reign, they were not above including juicy, scandalous gossip in their works. They would write about a queen's rumoured affairs, a king's impotence, or a prince's sexual deviancy, often with a moralising tone, but always with a keen eye for a good story. Their chronicles are a strange mix of official history and scandalous gossip, a kind of historical fiction that is both fascinating and, at times, unreliable. A curious medieval document that is particularly rich in this kind of scandalous gossip is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a historical record of the Anglo-Saxon kings. While it is a generally sober and factual account of events, it is not above including a juicy rumour or a scandalous tale. For instance, it records the rumour of a queen who was accused of poisoning her husband, a rumour that, while never proven, was a constant source of political intrigue and courtly gossip. It's a reminder that even in the most formal of historical records, a good story is a good story, and a good scandal is a good scandal. Historical scholars have long wrestled with the question of how to use these sources. Is it possible to separate fact from fiction, or should we just accept them as a form of historical fiction? The answer is murky, a testament to the fact that medieval history is a complex and often contradictory thing. We can't take every rumour at face value, but we also can't ignore the fact that these rumours existed and that they had a profound impact on the lives of the people they were about. The story of gossip and chroniclers is a story of a king's life that was never truly his own. His private moments were a matter for public discussion, and his most intimate secrets were a matter for historical record. This brings us to a new kind of royal punishment, one that was often a direct result of these rumours. As we will see, a queen who was accused of adultery could be subjected to a punishment that was both brutal and public, a kind of public shaming that was a direct result of the king's power and the court's gossip. The whispers of the court, you'll recall, were a powerful and dangerous force. A simple rumour could grow into a full-blown scandal, and a scandal could lead to a swift and brutal downfall. For a king, a scandal of this nature was often a nuisance, but for a queen or a mistress, it was often a death sentence. This brings us to a much darker and more terrifying aspect of medieval royal life: the punishments for adultery, a world of public humiliation and brutal justice that was both gendered and profoundly unfair. The profound double standard of adultery is a foundational truth of the medieval period. A mainstream historical fact confirms that for a king, adultery was a tolerated and often expected part of his life. He could have numerous mistresses and concubines without fear of legal or moral reprisal. But for a queen, or a noblewoman, adultery was a capital offence. It was not just a personal betrayal, it was a political crime that threatened the royal bloodline, the legitimacy of the succession, and the stability of the entire kingdom. A queen's body was not her own. It was a symbol of her kingdom's purity, and a single act of infidelity could lead to her complete ruin. The punishments for adultery were often brutal and public. A queen who was accused of adultery could be subjected to a trial, and if she was found guilty, she could be exiled, imprisoned, or, in the most extreme cases, executed. The most famous example is Anne Boleyn, the second wife of King Henry VIII, who was executed on charges of adultery and treason. But even for a common noblewoman, the punishment was often a public shaming. A woman might be stripped naked, tied to a post, and whipped, or she might be forced to walk through the streets of her town with a sign around her neck that declared her a whore. It was a kind of public spectacle, a way of humiliating a woman and a warning to others. A curious legal loophole that a king could use was to simply exile his wife rather than execute her. This was a way of getting rid of a politically inconvenient queen without the messiness of a public execution. The king would simply declare that his wife had been unfaithful, and she would be exiled to a nunnery or to a remote castle, where she would spend the rest of her days in quiet disgrace. This was a kind of gentler punishment, but it was still a life sentence, a life without her family, her children, and her court. Historians of the period have long questioned the extent to which these punishments were actually a deterrent, or if they were just a tool for a king to get rid of a politically inconvenient queen. Did a king who was having a string of affairs with his own mistresses actually care about his queen's fidelity? Or was he just using the charge of adultery as a pretext to get a new wife? The answer is murky, but it's not a stretch to imagine a king who was a master of political manipulation, using the charge of adultery to get what he wanted. The punishments for adultery show us that a king's power was not just political or military, it was also a kind of moral and legal power. He could not only create the law, but he could also enforce it, and he could use it to destroy the lives of those who stood in his way. This brings us to a new kind of royal ideal, one that was both a source of inspiration and a source of profound hypocrisy. As we will see, the Church's cult of the Virgin Mary created an impossible standard of purity for royal women, a standard that the king himself was often the first to violate. The brutal and gendered punishments for adultery reveal a profound hypocrisy at the heart of the medieval monarchy. A king could do as he pleased, but a queen's body was a public trust, a symbol of her kingdom's purity. And this standard of purity was not just a political matter, it was a religious one, an impossible ideal that was held up for every woman in the court, the ideal of the Virgin Mary. The cult of the Virgin Mary is a foundational truth of the High Middle Ages. A mainstream historical fact confirms that Mary was not just a saint, she was a goddess, a spiritual queen who was revered and adored by all of Europe. She was the ultimate ideal of female purity, piety, and motherhood, a woman who was both a virgin and a mother. This cult created an impossible standard for every woman in the court, especially for the queen, who was expected to be both a fertile vessel for heirs and a chaste, pure figure like Mary. This ideal created a profound conflict in a queen's life. She was expected to have sex with the king to produce heirs, but she was also expected to remain a symbol of purity. She was expected to be a wife and a mother, but she was also expected to be a kind of living saint, a woman who was above the carnal desires of the world. This was an impossible standard to live up to, a kind of psychological burden that must have weighed on every woman in the court. A curious analogy that was sometimes used was to see the Queen as a kind of mirror of the Virgin Mary, a woman who was a reflection of the Mother of God. This was a way of elevating the Queen's status, but it also placed her under an immense pressure to be a living symbol of purity. The Queen was a woman who was a mother, but she was also a woman who was expected to be a virgin, a kind of paradox that was at the heart of her life. It's a bit like a modern-day celebrity who is expected to be a sex symbol and a role model, but with a lot more talk of God and a lot less talk of social media. Academics have long pondered the extent to which the cult of the Virgin Mary was a genuine expression of piety, or a form of psychological control. Was the Church truly trying to elevate women, or was it a way of making them feel inferior and powerless in a male-dominated world? The answer is likely a bit of both. A powerful religious ideal that was used for a variety of purposes, both pious and political. The story of the cult of the Virgin Mary is a story of a king's hypocrisy, a man who was expected to revere the Virgin Mary, but who was also the first to violate her ideal of purity. It shows us that a king's life was not just about power and duty, it was also about a kind of spiritual and moral hypocrisy, a man who was expected to be a devout Christian, but who was also a man of immense power and appetite. This brings us to a new kind of royal spectacle, one that was both a sport and a sexual metaphor. As we will see, a king's love of the hunt was not just about killing animals, it was also about a much more primal and sexual kind of power, a kind of symbolic masculinity that was as much a part of his life as his crown and his scepter. The cult of the Virgin Mary, you'll recall, held a queen to an impossible standard of purity. But a king, in his divine right, was a man of power and appetite, a man who had to project an image of masculinity and virility. And one of the most powerful and public ways he did this was not in the bedchamber, but in the fields and forests of his kingdom. You're now entering the world of hunting as sexual metaphor, a place where a king's love of the chase was not just a sport, it was a powerful and often bizarre expression of his sexual power. The profound importance of hunting is a foundational truth of the medieval monarchy. A mainstream historical fact confirms that it was not just a sport, it was a political, social, and cultural ritual, a public performance of masculinity and power. A king who was a great hunter was a king who was a great warrior, a man who was in control of his kingdom and his own destiny. And a king's love of the hunt, for all its solemnity, was often a very sexual thing. The sexual metaphors embedded in the hunt were both subtle and explicit. The chase of the animal, the capture of the beast, and the kill of the prey were often seen as a symbolic reenactment of a king's sexual conquest. The king, in this sense, was not just hunting an animal, he was hunting a woman, a prize to be won and conquered. The stag, with its magnificent antlers, was a symbol of virility, and the boar, with its tusk and its aggression, was a symbol of power. Killing them was a way of symbolically conquering these qualities, a way of showing the world that the king was a man of immense power and immense virility. It's a bit like a modern-day sports figure who is seen as a symbol of masculine power, but with a lot more talk of blood and a lot less talk of touchdowns. A curious ritual that was often a part of the hunt was the purity of the kill. After a king had killed a stag or a boar, he would often perform a ritual where he would cut open the animal and present its heart or liver to the queen or to a lady of the court. This was not just a trophy, it was a symbolic offering, a kind of sexual conquest that was being offered to a woman. The king was, in a very real sense, saying to the woman, "I am a man of immense power, and I offer this power to you." It's a very different kind of courtship than we might think of today, and it shows us that a king's love of the hunt was not just about killing animals, it was also about a much more primal and sexual kind of power. Historical scholars have long wrestled with the question of whether these sexual metaphors were consciously understood and used by the kings themselves, or if they are a modern interpretation of a more primal, less conscious ritual. Did a king who was hunting a stag actually think he was hunting a woman, or was he just a man who loved to hunt? The answer is murky, but it's not a stretch to imagine a king who was a master of metaphor, using the hunt as a way of projecting an image of power and virility that he may not have felt in the bedchamber. The story of hunting as a sexual metaphor is a story of a king's hypocrisy, a man who was expected to be a devout Christian, but who was also a man who was a master of sexual metaphor and symbolic conquest. It shows us that a king's life was not just about power and duty, it was also about a kind of sexual and symbolic power, a kind of primal masculinity that was as much a part of his life as his crown and his scepter. This brings us to a specific and very bizarre example of a king's sexuality, a king who, in his defiance of all social norms, became a legend. The sexual metaphors of the hunt, you'll recall, were a powerful way for a king to project an image of masculinity and power. But sometimes, a king, in his defiance of all social norms, would choose a different path, a path that was not just a defiance of tradition, but a defiance of the very nature of his kingship. This brings us to a specific and very bizarre example of a king's sexuality, a king who, in his love for another man, became a legend. This, of course, is the story of King Edward II of England, a man whose relationships with his male favourites, particularly Piers Gaveston, became a political scandal that alienated his nobility and eventually led to his downfall. A mainstream historical fact confirms that Edward's relationships with his male favourites were not just a personal matter, they were a political one, a matter that would, in the end, cost him his throne. The political fallout of these relationships was profound. Edward would shower Gaveston with titles, wealth, and power, often at the expense of his own nobles. He would make him a powerful earl, a man who was, in all but name, the king's second-in-command. This created a profound sense of resentment and anger in the court, a resentment that was not just about the king's sexual preference, but also about his perceived injustice. A king who would give all his power to a commoner, a man who had no noble blood, was a king who was seen as a danger to the kingdom. The role of Queen Isabella of France, Edward's wife, in this drama was both tragic and fascinating. She was initially a pawn in this political game, a woman who was married to a man who had no interest in her. But she eventually became the leader of a rebellion against her husband, a rebellion that was fueled by his neglect and his favouritism. She would eventually lead an invasion of England, and with the support of the nobility, she would depose her husband and place her son, Edward III, on the throne. It's a powerful reminder that a king's private life was never truly private, and a queen, for all her powerlessness, was still a political force to be reckoned with. A curious detail about Gaveston's banishment is that he was banished several times, but Edward always found a way to bring him back. On one occasion, the nobles forced Edward to exile Gaveston, but Edward, in his defiance, simply appointed him as his representative in Ireland, a move that was seen as a profound act of defiance and a slap in the face to his nobility. It's a bit like a modern political leader who is forced to fire his chief of staff, but then gives him a more powerful job in a different country. The defiance was both brilliant and, in the end, suicidal. Historical scholars have long wrestled with the question of whether Edward II's sexuality was the primary cause of his downfall, or if it was a symptom of a deeper political crisis. Was he a weak king who was simply a victim of his own desires, or was he a king who was a victim of a powerful nobility that was simply looking for an excuse to depose him? The answer is murky, but it's not a stretch to imagine a king who was a victim of both. The story of Edward II is a story of a king who, in his defiance of all social norms, became a legend. It shows us that a king's sexuality was not just a personal matter, it was a political one, a matter that could lead to his downfall. This brings us to a much broader and more mystical side of a king's life, a world of folk beliefs and legends. As we will see, a king's virility was not just a political matter, it was a matter for the land itself, a symbol of the kingdom's health and prosperity. The tragic downfall of King Edward II shows us that a king's virility was never just a personal matter. It was a matter of state, a political weapon to be used and wielded with skill. But this belief in a king's sexual power went far beyond the political manoeuvring of the nobility. It was a deep-seated, mystical belief, a part of the very soil of the kingdom itself. You're now stepping into the world of sexual folklore and kingship, a place where a king's virility was not just a symbol, it was a supernatural force that could influence the health and prosperity of the land. The deep-seated folk belief that a king's sexual virility was a supernatural force is a foundational truth of the medieval period. A mainstream historical fact confirms that a potent king was a sign of a prosperous kingdom, a land of bountiful harvests, healthy livestock, and a growing population. An impotent king, however, was a sign of a cursed kingdom, a land of famine, plague, and death. The king's body was, in a very real sense, a metaphorical garden, and his ability to produce an heir was a sign of his ability to make the land fertile and prosperous. This belief was reinforced by a variety of rituals and legends. The most famous of these was the belief in the sacred marriage, a pagan ritual that was often incorporated into Christian ceremonies, where a king's marriage was seen as a union of the king and the land itself. The king's marriage in this sense was a kind of magical act, a way of ensuring the fertility of his kingdom. It's like a medieval version of a farmer's almanac, but instead of relying on the stars, you're relying on the king's sexual prowess. A curious analogy that was sometimes used was to see the king's virility as a kind of magical force that was tied to the health of his livestock. Some stories suggest that if a king was impotent, his cattle would fail to breed, his horses would go lame, and his fields would turn to dust. The king's sexual vitality was seen as a kind of magical force that permeated the land. It's a very weird kind of cause and effect, isn't it? Sorry, but the grain harvest is down again. The king must be having another bad week in the bedchamber. Academics have long pondered the extent to which these beliefs were sincerely held by the common people, or if they were a form of psychological control over the monarch, making him constantly aware of his public role. Was it a genuine grassroots belief? Or was it a clever tool used by the church and the nobility to keep the king in line? The answer is likely a bit of both. A deeply ingrained folk belief that was skillfully co-opted and amplified by the ruling class. The king's body was, in the end, never his own. It was a symbol, a tool, a public performance of power and virility. And a king's life, for all its intimacy, was a performance of power and duty. This brings us to a new kind of royal tragedy, one that was a direct result of a king's power and his sexual habits. As we will see, the bizarre and often tragic role of eunuchs in the royal court was a direct result of a king's power and his desire for a kind of sexual control. The king's virility, as we've seen, was a source of power, a magical force that could make the land fertile and his people prosperous. But this immense sexual power also created a profound sense of anxiety, a fear of betrayal, and a desire for absolute control. And sometimes, this desire for control led a king to commit a profoundly bizarre and often tragic act, the use of royal eunuchs in his court. These men, often castrated as young boys, lived a life of immense privilege and profound trauma, and their presence in the royal court was a testament to a king's desire for a kind of sexual control that was both absolute and profoundly sad. The existence of eunuchs in some medieval courts is a grim truth of history. A mainstream historical fact confirms that in a world where a king's power was absolute, his desire for control over his harem, his queen, and his court was often absolute as well. Eunuchs were seen as the perfect solution to this problem. They were men who were, in a very real sense, no longer men. They were castrated as young boys, and their primary function was to serve as trusted attendants and guards for the women of the court. A king could trust a eunuch with his queen and his concubines, knowing that there was no risk of sexual impropriety, no risk of a bastard child being born in his court. It's a very high-stakes version of a trust, but verified policy, but with a lot more violence. The tragic reality of a eunuch's life was a strange mix of immense privilege and profound psychological and physical trauma. They were often castrated as young boys, and their lives were a constant negotiation of power and powerlessness. They were trusted advisors, confidant, and even military commanders, a strange mix of power and powerlessness. They were men who could not have children, yet they were often the ones who were in charge of the king's children. They were men who could not have sex, yet they were often the ones who were in charge of the king's harem. It was a kind of brutal irony, a life that was both a blessing and a curse. A curious detail about the eunuch's role is the belief that their lack of sexuality made them more loyal and trustworthy. The king could trust a eunuch with his most private secrets, knowing that the eunuch would never be a rival for his queen or his concubines. The eunuch was a man who was, in a very real sense, a part of the king's family, but he was also a man who was, in a very real sense, not a part of the king's family. He was a kind of a living paradox, a man who is both a man and not a man who was both a part of the king's court and not a part of it. Academics have long pondered the question of whether the use of eunuchs was a genuine expression of a king's desire for control or a form of political theatre, a way of showing the world that he was a man of immense power. Was the king truly worried about his queen's fidelity, or was he just a man who was using his power to create a kind of bizarre and tragic courtly ritual? The answer is murky, but it's not a stretch to imagine a king who was a victim of both. The story of eunuchs is a story of a king's power and his desire for control. It shows us that a king's power was not just political or military. It was also a kind of sexual and moral power, a power to shape the very lives of the people around him. This brings us to the final conclusion of our story, a conclusion that will tie all these threads together. The tragic tale of eunuchs and a king's desire for absolute control brings us to the very heart of our story. You've seen how a king's private life was a public spectacle, a breeding ground for scandal and political intrigue. You've seen how his body was a symbol of his kingdom, and how his every act, from the solemnity of his marriage to the privacy of his bedchamber, was a performance of power and duty. Now, we draw all these threads together to a single, overarching truth. A king's perceived potentia, virility, and the throne were inextricably linked. The profound belief that a king's sexual potency was a divine gift is a foundational truth of the medieval monarchy. A mainstream historical fact confirms that his ability to produce an heir was not just a personal quality, it was a supernatural force, a kind of sacred fire that had to be kept burning for the good of the kingdom. This was the bedrock of his right to rule, a fundamental aspect of his kingship. Without it, he was seen as a man who had failed in his most fundamental duty, a king who had lost his divine right to rule. This belief in the king's potency was the driving force behind all the bizarre practices we've discussed. The desperate need for a male heir led him to engage in strange rituals, from praying to saints to drinking strange potions. The immense pressure to prove his virility led him to take mistresses and concubines, to engage in adulterous affairs, and to use the hunt as a kind of sexual metaphor. The king's body was a garden, and his sexual power was the sun and the rain that made it grow. Without it, the garden would wither and die. A curious analogy from this period's folklore is the belief that a king's virility was a kind of spiritual well, a source of sacred water that flowed through the kingdom, making the rivers run, the crops grow, and the people prosper. An impotent king was a king whose well had run dry, a man who could no longer bring life to his kingdom. This was a terrifying thought, a kind of spiritual and political death that was worse than a physical death. The king's sexuality was, in a very real sense, a source of life itself. Academics have long pondered the question of whether this focus on potency was a genuine belief or a social construct, a way of legitimizing male power and a patriarchal system. Was it a real fear, or was it a form of political theatre, a way of showing the world that the king was a man who was worthy of his throne? The answer is likely a bit of both, a deeply ingrained folk belief that was skillfully co-opted and amplified by the ruling class. The story of a king's potency is a story of a king's power and his weakness. It shows us that a king's power was not just political or military. It was also a kind of sexual and moral power, a power that could be both a source of immense strength and a source of profound weakness. This was the burden of kingship, a life of immense privilege and profound psychological and physical pressure. The king was a man who was, in a very real sense, a slave to his own potency. And so, as the king's bedchamber, a stage for power and intrigue, finally falls silent, you can hear the faint whispers of history echoing through the corridors of time. These whispers tell us that a king's life was never truly his own. His body, his desires, and his most intimate moments were all a part of a larger, more bizarre, and more profound story. A story that was written not just in the chronicles, but in the very fabric of his kingdom itself. The oil lamp is now merely a glowing ember, and the cicadas outside have settled into a gentle, sleepy hum. You've journeyed through the subtle societal norms, the ingenious practicalities, the strange medical theories, and the quiet solidarities of a world long gone. Their struggles with discomfort, their pursuit of hygiene, their silent strength in the face of taboo, and their enduring connection to the rhythms of nature paint a picture of resilience and resourcefulness. You now understand that even the most private aspects of life carry profound historical weight, connecting you to countless women across millennia. Take a deep, peaceful breath, letting the details settle into the quiet corners of your mind. There's nothing left to do now but let the calm wash over you. The past has spoken its secrets. Sleep well.